A while ago we did something that was definitely equal parts crazy and stupid here on the channel. But now that I'm saying that out loud, I realise that doesn't really narrow down a lot of the content at all. So let me explain. The thing that I'm talking about was this. And the topic was cooling a CPU with a GPU cooler. For those of you that haven't seen the original video, which I will have linked below for you, the questions that we wanted to ask was, is it even possible? Are there any benefits? And does it run cooler or quieter? The TLDR for that video was yes, probably not, and not really. But we were hoping for so much more than that. You see, we ran into a pretty significant issue where the GPU cooler was conflicting with capacitors on the motherboard, which forced us to use a copper shim between the CPU and the GPU cooler. An incredibly suboptimal solution in terms of cooling efficiency. But today we're revamping everything, getting direct contact and finally making this solution work the way that I originally intended for it to. So sit back, relax, and let's mount something where it absolutely doesn't belong. Oh yeah, we upgraded to a 5950X. This might be a bad idea. Okay, so let me talk you through what's going to be the same and what's going to be different in this video to make sure that we get direct contact between the GPU cooler and the CPU itself. Because we're going to be using the Arctic Accelero Extreme 3 cooler, the exact same one as last time. So you can tell I haven't even been bothered to take the thermal paste off or the mounting solution, so we will need to do that at some point. And the other thing that's going to be the same is we've got our nice little handy adapter between the GPU fan header and the motherboard PWM fan header. Perfect. But what we're going to be doing different is we're going to be swapping over to AMD. Now, there's an odd reason for this. And this is something that I've learned from David Does Tech Stuff. The only other person crazy enough to do something like this other than myself, apparently. So when he did his GPU cooler on a CPU, he used AMD instead of Intel, and there was a huge benefit to that. He ended up avoiding a mounting solution issue that I had a huge problem with. On my Intel motherboard that I use, this is the MSI MPG Z390 Gaming Edge AC, we have these capacitors, and they actually sit above the CPU's integrated heat spreader. Now, this seems to be a common implementation for Intel motherboards. I'm not entirely sure of the technical reason why those capacitors are close to the CPU socket compared to AMD. Now, if you look up an AM4 motherboard on Google, it will be very similar to this. Capacitors significantly further away. You'll actually see them underneath this heatsink next to the rear I/O. So this gives us a lot more flexibility in our mounting solution, as we have nothing that will sit above the CPU until we get to this heatsink, which means if we do a test fit of our Arctic Accelero heatsink right here, you see that almost looks like it was meant for that. But it does beg the question, am I installing the cooler onto the motherboard or the motherboard onto the cooler? But that is the plan. But there is one other idea that I'm going to steal from David, and it's an idea that's been implemented for what I like to call ghetto cooling solutions, mounting something where it absolutely doesn't belong. And that's one sentence that he said.
All you need to do is zip tie one to another and then you're good. But all you need to do is zip tie one to another and then you're good.
Yes, zip tie one to another and you've got a mounting solution. So that's what we're going to do today, because that took a lot of effort, and to be honest, it was probably unnecessary. So first things first, let's figure out what our control is, how fast and how cool this 5950X should run with a standard CPU cooler, which we'll be using the Hyper 212 Black Edition. So let's get that set up and run some benchmarks. Well, that might just be the sexiest blacked out test bench ever. I really like how all the parts came together. The Hyper 212 Black Edition, the Corsair LPX blacked out memory, and the RTX 3060 Ti from MSI. It's completely stealth, and I think it looks really quite good. But more importantly, how does our control system perform? Well, that's what we have set up here. But there's a couple of things that we need to go over before we start running benchmarks and recording our data. The thermal interface material is the Icy Diamond graphite pad, and that's going to remain consistent between this setup, our control, and the GPU cooler on the CPU. So we're going to be using the graphite pad for both. we're also going to be using the same percentage base fan curve, because then we can have a look at the fan RPM in relation to the Hyper 212 Black Edition and the Arctic Accelero Extreme 3 cooler. So let's run some benchmarks and record some data. The Hyper 212 Black Edition managed to put up some pretty respectable numbers against the 5950X. Most importantly, our average temperature being 68.2 degrees and our maximum temperature being 80.8. This gave us an average clock of 4.512 GHz and a Cinebench score of 24,216. So if you wanted to know if a Hyper 212 Black Edition could cool a 5950X, it absolutely can. Okay, so those are the numbers that we need to beat. So now it comes time for the fun stuff. We need to attach this GPU cooler onto the CPU whilst maintaining even and enough pressure so that we can actually cool it efficiently. So let's head over to the table and look at what's involved in that. Should be interesting. Okay, so this should be everything that we need to mount the GPU cooler to the CPU. I'm gonna run you through some of the parts and my mentality behind it and how we can actually mount this. So the GPU is kind of necessary at the moment because we're going to need to protect it. As far as I can see, when we mount the GPU cooler onto the CPU, we could potentially scratch the backplate of our 3060 Ti, and that would not be good because they're a little bit hard to come by at the moment, so I don't want to damage it. So then we've got the 3 fans for our Accelero, which we have our adapter from the last video, right here, and of course the mandatory zip ties. But we're going to be using the original mounting plate for the Arctic Accelero 3 and removing the one that I custom made. So that should be it really, and hopefully it'll be a straightforward process, but these things never are. And the first things first, we've got to clean up our old thermal paste mess. Oh, all right. That almost came clean off. Okay, I'm just gonna chuck that in the bin later. Don't tell my wife that I just threw that on the floor. Anyway, let's take our old mounting solution off. 2 more things that we don't need. Okay, isopropyl alcohol pad. Give this a good clean. So that is a clean base plate. And the next thing that we're gonna do is reattach the mounting bracket for the Accelero. Okay, so memory is out. So the next thing that we've got to do is to actually mount the GPU cooler. Now, underneath this, what's called an IHS, integrated heat spreader, with Ryzen, it uses a chiplet design. So there'll be a few individual dies for individual CCXs and the memory controller. This is different compared to Intel. Intel uses what's known as a monolithic die, as in one single die that handles everything. Memory controller, it's the cores, it's everything. So with Ryzen, it's actually more important that you're central onto the IHS with your cold plate. So if we have a look at a test fit, I think we are pretty much bang on the IHS, as close as we could possibly get. Hopefully you guys can see that. That is base plate directly on the IHS, which is fantastic. The only concern that I have is that we might be interfering with the GPU, and that's why I have some tape. Okay, let's grab some zip ties. It's gonna be weird. Cool. So this is it. This is the Arctic Accelero Extreme 3 cooler mounted directly to a 5950X 16-core CPU, and then the 3060 Ti can slot in just like so. I would like to introduce you to my new computer. Look at how stupid that looks. That's amazing. Can you even see the motherboard? All right, I really hope that this works as good as I want it to. Cool, so let's find out if this works. It's just so weird. Let's put it on the test bench, see what the thermal results are. Okay, so we have the Arctic Accelero Extreme 3 cooler mounted to the 5950X, about to run some benchmarks. Our idle temperatures are about the low 30s, high 20s, which is excellent and actually quite promising. So hopefully we can beat the Hyper 212 Black Edition, and this is the moment where we find out. So 30 minutes of stress testing, then 10 minutes of collecting data after that, and then we can compare against the Hyper 212 Black Edition, and maybe, just maybe, the Arctic Accelero Extreme 3 cooler is a better CPU cooler than a CPU cooler? Let's find out. The Arctic Accelero Extreme 3 cooler did an amazing job, with an average temperature of 61.3 degrees and a maximum temperature of 74.5. In terms of clock speed, we had 4.558 gigahertz and a Cinebench score of 24,463. Now how does this compare against our control, the Hyper 212 Black Edition? Well, it beats it in almost every measurable metric. About 7 degrees cooler on average, about 6 degrees lower in terms of maximum temperature, and to top it off, about a 1% increase in terms of clock speed and Cinebench score. So if you're looking for a cooler that's better than a Hyper 212 Evo, does an outstanding job of keeping your VRM and M.2 cool, and is truly quite unique, this might still be an incredibly stupid idea. So check out the video description for all the parts that I've used here today, as well as some other videos if you are new here. But if you are new here, get subscriber notifications to make sure that you don't miss any more upcoming videos. Otherwise guys, a like is always appreciated, and I will see you in the next one.